Coming in at the lowest rank are the troopers of the Empire. At the bottom were the Imperial Army troops, that were the grunts and infantry backbone over all the sectors that the Empire governed over. Right above them were the Stormtrooper Corps, who were considered the elite trooper class of the Empire. There were different designation among the Stormtroopers, which were signified by their pauldrons. A black pauldron was a Stormtrooper Corporal, who was in charge when a sergeant wasn't present. He could perform duties independently and could order troopers around, but had little authority otherwise. Sergeants during the Clone Wars commanded squads of 9 troopers. Meanwhile, an entire platoon had 4 sergeants. The same system was used during the Imperial era after the Republic was reorganized into the Empire. The Stormtrooper sergeant was signified by his white pauldron. He was usually more experienced than other troopers and had better performance stats than a corporal. In absence of a Stormtrooper chief or captain, the sergeant was in charge of an entire Stormtrooper squad. If he was in charge of the entire squad, his pauldron would be swapped to orange, but he would still remain at the sergeant rank, just being the most experienced one and highest-ranking sergeant in the platoon. Wearing an orange pauldron would have them be called Stormtrooper Commanders, although their rank officially was still just a sergeant. They can be seen quite often in Star Wars Rebels, especially in Season 1, where a sergeant with a white pauldron can be seen leading out his squad alongside the Grand Inquisitor to confront Ezra and Kanan. Additionally, though, to make it more confusing, the orange pauldron was also given to Stormtrooper Field Commanders, who were leading a company of Stormtroopers on the ground. Finally is the Stormtrooper Chief, who is designated by a red pauldron. He was usually second in command of an entire Stormtrooper platoon. However, it was rare for chiefs to actually wear their Stormtrooper armor, and rather were in officer uniforms mostly. Stormtroopers that excelled at their tasks would sometimes be considered for more elite roles than like Scout Troopers, Incinerator Troopers, or even Death Troopers. Before moving on to the different officer ranks, I'd like to note it's a complete mess, but I tried to make the most sense of it. Also, it's important to note that the Empire split between the Army, which handled any ground-based operations, and the Navy, which was in charge of space cruisers and battles associated with that. The thing is, each branch has similar names for their ranks. In between them was also the ISB, which had their own rankings, which were called the same way. Imperial Army lieutenants were the lowest-ranking officers in the Army. He was in command of platoons and above any sergeant or commander in the Stormtrooper squad and would give his orders directly to them. Furthermore, lieutenants often managed smaller outposts, being in charge of logistics and, at times, leading troops into battle. They wore a regular Imperial officer's uniform in gray or olive green with rank plates. Their plaques usually have 2 red tiles and 1 blue square. The red tiles indicate their military authority on ground forces, while the blue square symbolizes their tactical expertise. Another theory suggests that red means their access to ground resources and blue means their access to space resources. The more of each tile you had, the stronger your expertise and authority was in each section. So, if we apply this logic to the lieutenants, it means that they have some authority over troops like Stormtrooper and Imperial Army troopers, and also were somewhat tactically averse, and had some command over space shuttles and TIE fighters. The most notable lieutenant we ever see is Gorn, who was on Aldhani during the heist and helped the rebellion achieve their first major victory, as he became disillusioned with the Empire. We see quite nicely what his role was during the episodes up to the heist, where he was in charge of placing the troops and also planning their shifts. The Imperial Navy lieutenants, on the other hand, had 2 blue tiles and 1 red tile, meaning they had more authority over space resources and less on ground forces, but was still involved with both of them. Above the lieutenant comes the captain. He was designated by 3 red tiles above 3 blue tiles. As far as the Navy is concerned, this rank allowed captains to gain command of their own light cruisers, smaller corvettes, and smaller dreadnoughts with hundreds of people under his command. In the Imperial Army, it's more of a mid-level rank where they'd be commanders of Stormtrooper companies, or at times even entire battalions. Any of the Stormtroopers we covered all answered to a captain. Unlike the clone captains in the Clone Wars, though, Imperial Army captains rarely ever participated in battles themselves, and were rather in the back line trying to coordinate their troops from there. I'd like to think, though, that the chrome-colored Stormtroopers, just like Captain Phasma, were Stormtrooper captains, but this is purely my own fiction. Commandants were ranks given to individuals that held authority over a specific complex like an outpost, prison, or factory. Their rank plaque had different ways depicted, and they weren't really part of either the Army or the Navy, and stood outside of them. However, they only held authority over their assigned complex and had none for anything outside of it. A notable commandant is Commandant Bihaz, who was the highest rank officer on the Aldhani outpost when it was raided by Cassian and gang. He had 4 blue tiles and 2 red tiles in a line, showing how his role was more tactical in nature. Supervisor was a rank that was only held by members of the ISB. They were signified by their white officer uniform with black pants, and their rank plates had a single row of 3 blue tiles, meaning that they were purely for tactical purposes and didn't hold any rank over ground forces. In a military role, the supervisors would be granted the rank of lieutenant. Some supervisors had 4 tiles, meaning they were higher in rank and held the rank of captain. Supervisor Lagret held that rank during the events of Andor and was thus ranked higher than any other Imperials. Supervisors had their own assigned sectors and would gather intelligence and delegate assets to these within their sectors. Below the supervisors were also ISB attendants, who were basically junior supervisors and had only 2 blue tiles and wore gray uniforms. The attendant, if he was to ever rise through the ranks, could eventually become a supervisor himself. All ISB supervisors were stationed on Coruscant at the ISB central office and would have weekly meetings to report their progress and activities to a higher up, most of the times this being a major. They each also had their own office within the central office where they'd coordinate their tasks. Dedra Meero and several of the other supervisors like Blevin or Lana Young, which we see in Andor, all held this title. Agent was a title that was assigned to outfield operatives of the Imperial Security Bureau. They had a rank plate with 2 blue, 1 red, and 1 gray tile. The gray-colored tile stood for any sort of intelligence operations that the wearer is involved in. With this plaque, they held the rank of captain and were thus authorized to command entire Stormtrooper platoons and be in charge of light cruisers. Agent Kallus most notably was an outfield agent dispatched to deal with the rebels on Lothal. However, as agents of the ISB, they could override regular procedure of the Imperial ranking system, and in the name of the ISB, take command of Star Destroyers if they deem necessary, and fire personnel they deem unfit. Outfield and undercover agents like Commander Iden Versio of Inferno Squad were also officially classified as agents. Major was a rank held in all 3 Imperial branches, Navy, Army, and ISB. Army majors were a step above the captains because they were now in command of their own battalion of ground troops, unlike a company as a captain. In the Navy, a major was responsible for the Imperial Starfighter Corps section, being in command of an entire squadron wing. In the ISB, a major was placed above all supervisors and agents. He was responsible for overseeing their weekly activities and led the meetings to ensure they'd stay on track to only have the Empire's best interest in mind, while also being an open ear for the supervisors and agents. Mostly it was senior officers that had been within the Empire system for long periods that eventually claimed this rank. Regarding their rank plaque, there were many inconsistencies. Sometimes they have 2 rows of 4 red and blue tiles. There are also majors in the Army with 8 all-red tiles, but others also wear the standard Imperial uniform, but have 6 tiles divided into 2 rows, with both rows having a single red tile on their right side while the rest were blue. Also, there are majors with just 5 blue tiles in a row. A notable Army major was Major Marquand, who served under General Veers as an AT-AT pilot before being promoted to major later down the line. Major Partagaz from Andor was an ISB major and can be seen leading the supervisor meetings. He's also one of my preferred characters from the series. Just the way he conducted himself in the meetings felt so much like how I'd imagine an Imperial completely indoctrinated to act. Smart and ruthless. Great character. Above the major were the colonels. Unlike majors, who are known for commanding battalions, colonels can command entire regiments. There are also several grades of colonels in the Imperial Army. The lowest is a lieutenant colonel who can command up to 4,000 soldiers in a single regiment. High colonels, meanwhile, controlled 4 to 8 regiments of 4,000 soldiers, allowing them to command up to more than 32,000 soldiers in total. Colonels are also found in different branches of the Empire outside the Army. This includes the ISB and the Starfighter Corps. Colonels in the ISB were some of the highest-ranking ISB members, and Wolf Yularen, a former Admiral of the Republic, is the best-known ISB colonel. As colonel, Yularen had to root out sedition against the Empire within the Senate, as well as supervise any intelligence activities in the galaxy that could pose a threat. He could also overrule the Empire's hierarchy and take command of Star Destroyers or similar if deemed necessary, although most of the time his station was back on Coruscant rather than with the Navy or the Army. The rank plaques of these colonels differed depending on the branch of the Empire they work for. Yularen had 3 red and 3 blue tiles, meaning he had command over ground forces as well as naval forces. Commodore was a rank that was only found in the Imperial Navy. It was a rather high rank, and only senior officers could hope to achieve it. A Commodore was in charge of an entire Star Destroyer, and was the rank most senior officers have to go through if they ever were to rise to Admiral. Thrawn in his new book trilogy served as a Commodore and was in charge of his own Star Destroyer Chimera, before being promoted to Admiral later. Commanders have an odd positioning within the Imperial Navy because they're in parallel to certain ranks. They're ranked alongside a Commodore and above a Captain. That means they can be in charge of entire Star Destroyers or even a group of ships. But the commander's role isn't always permanent. There are times when commanders are only given temporary assignments to a specific ship or unit before being assigned to another role. That is why their rank can be equal to other ranks within the Navy. Still, there are inconsistencies because some commanders, especially during the height of the Empire, were still considered inferior to captains. While commanders do have high ranks, their plaques don't always indicate their status. Most often, they were depicted with 3 red tiles over 3 blue tiles, but I couldn't really find an image that fit it. Brigadier generals are in the senior ranks of the Imperial Army, being in command of large troop formations and leading planetary invasions. They usually oversee entire regiments or garrison forces stationed in Imperial-occupied worlds. That means they serve as top field commanders just below the higher-ranking generals. Brigadier generals, unlike the other generals, are often more concerned with field operations and frontline battles. They're almost always on the ground, coordinating stormtrooper units, armor divisions, and artillery. That is why their rank plaques, as such, show a good balance of 4 red and blue tiles placed above each other, meaning they have high military authority as well as a respectable tactical command capability. The rank of general isn't as widely used by the Empire as it was during the Clone Wars, as the Jedi Knights were all automatically assigned the rank of general. It was a rank only found in the Imperial Army. A general commanded frontline troops, coordinated assaults, and handled the tactical planning on the ground. They were placed below admirals, who usually would let the general do the ground assault planning. But the authority of an Imperial general wasn't restricted to the army. You'd also find generals serving with starfighter units in the Imperial Navy, and even working in the Imperial Security Bureau. No one's really sure how their rank structure worked in those branches, but it can be assumed that it's similar to the Army or the Stormtrooper Corps. As for their uniforms, Imperial generals typically wore rank plaques with 4 red squares over 4 blue ones, which is confusing as it's the same as the Brigadier General. This is where the code cylinder comes in, which were a further specification. A general was usually given more cylinders, which meant that he had access to more sections and information within the Empire like detention levels, secret plans, and more. Maximilian Veers was one of the most prominent generals during the final days of the Empire, as he led the Empire's forces on the ground during the Battle of Hoth. In fact, he personally took command of the AT-AT assault that broke through the rebel defenses during that decisive battle, to make sure that they'd achieved the target of destroying the rebel base. Above the regular generals was the High General. This position goes back to the time of the Galactic Republic when the Jedi were given the ranks of general. The most distinguished among the Jedi generals during the time of the Clone Wars were the High Generals. Chief among them was Obi-Wan Kenobi. When the Republic was reorganized into the Empire, this position was retained but was given to actual military personnel instead of Jedi. Being the highest rank in the Imperial Army, High Generals have authority over any ground forces, commanding large-scale military operations across not just one planet, but entire sectors. While generals command armies, High Generals commanded entire systems armies. It's unknown which rank plaque they had, though. The highest-ranking army officers in the entire Imperial Army were the Grand Generals, which were the equivalent to the Imperial Navy's Grand Admiral. They were in command of the entire Imperial Army, and every general and high general reported to them. Their uniform also had several different variations. Some depicted their rank plaques with 6 all-red plaques across to signify their supreme military command over all ground forces. However, others also put them closer to the Grand Admiral's plaque by having 6 blue tiles, 3 red, and 3 yellow. At this point, I could explain what yellow means. Yellow stood for any sort of political influence that the wearer of a yellow plaque held, or how he had control over resources and infrastructure. Also, being able to influence rules and laws of planets and systems. But again, this is just speculation and fan interpretation, and not really rooted in any official media. The only Grand General we know of was Cassio Tag. Although there were inconsistencies about his rank, it's widely agreed that he held something similar to the position of a Grand General, as he was the highest-ranking Imperial Army member. He's also the guy in A New Hope who deemed the Death Star as the greatest weapon in the galaxy. Vice Admirals are just a step below the highest ranks in the Navy, often commanding several Star Destroyers and overseeing them. As far as naval officers are concerned, Vice Admirals only answer to Admirals. They actually are quite similar to Admirals in their authority level, but had less influence within the greater hierarchy of the Empire compared to Admirals. Vice Admirals, however, also have a certain measure of independence depending on what their mission requires. They can even take on different roles that are not related to their primary function as commanders of entire fleets, as was the case for Vice Admiral Rampart, who was actually in charge of the Empire's enlistment of conscripted soldiers to replace the clone troopers. Despite their high ranks, Vice Admirals have modest rank plaques consisting of 2 blue squares beside 4 red squares, which doesn't make too much sense once again with the explanation of red being ground forces and blue being navy, as this guy should have more blue in my opinion, but it was in the Disney era and they've never cared about continuity anyway. Not that there was any for their rank plaques to begin with. Another known Vice Admiral was Gilead Palayan, the second-in-command to Grand Admiral Thrawn during his Empire's air campaign. There's also Ray Sloan, who held that rank. The Admiral position was one of the highest ranks in the entire Imperial Navy. Admirals were in command of a squadron of capital ships such as Star Destroyers. On deck of a Star Destroyer, they were usually the highest-ranking member during operations. They also had some political duties. Their rank was signified by a row of 6 red tiles above 6 blue tiles. There are several well-known admirals in the Empire. One that immediately jumps to mind was Admiral Ozet, the guy who exited hyperspace too close to Hoth and thus alerted the rebels about the Empire coming in. He was then choked to death by Vader, and then his post was given to Firmus Piet, who jumped from First Officer to Admiral just like that. Fleet Admirals, unlike Admirals, were in command of entire fleets of Star Destroyers and commanded these from their own flagship. They could also at will take command of task forces, ship squadrons, and any vessel in their fleet. They also had the same rank plaque as an Admiral, though with 6 red and 6 blue tiles in 2 rows. Admiral Piet was in fact promoted to Fleet Admiral prior to the Battle of Endor and was in charge of the defense of the Death Star. This title was one of the highest ranks within the Imperial Navy and even above Fleet Admirals. They were the de facto commander of an entire sector's Navy forces. Even though this role is usually what the Moffs were for, in certain sectors where there was the necessity for frequent naval interception, the Moffs rather installed a High Admiral to take care of this task they deemed as tedious and not worth their time. The Grand Admiral rank is arguably the only rank that is unquestionably more powerful than most other ranks in the Imperial military. Technically, while they may be admirals, Grand Admirals are elite commanders who are well outside the technical leadership ladder within the Empire. They could at any time overrule the Governor, Moff, or Fleet Admiral of any system in the galaxy if deemed necessary. Their power within the Imperial hierarchy was unchecked by anyone except the Emperor, Darth Vader, and a few others like the Grand Moff above him. Unlike other officers who usually wore gray and olive green, Grand Admirals wore brilliant white uniforms. Their rank plaque had a total of 12 squares, with 6 blue tiles, 3 red, and 3 yellow tiles. This means they had absolute control over the Navy, ground forces to a high degree, and also political parts in their assignments. It was said to be almost impossible to reach this rank through the Imperial career ladder, as it was granted by Emperor Palpatine himself. They outranked any admirals, Moffs, and even sector governors, making them powerful symbols of the Emperor's will. There were 12 Grand Admirals in the entire Navy, and the most notorious one was obviously Thrawn, the brilliant Chiss tactician who was the only alien allowed to enter the Empire's hierarchy and to achieve this incredible rank. He was well deserving of it, though, as there was no one in the galaxy that came close to Thrawn's tactical brilliance. Other Grand Admirals were Rey Sloane, however she was appointed after the Battle of Endor. Exiting the Empire's Army and Navy, here's the Director. They operated as head of certain organizations within the Empire and were given authority depending on how important their organization or project was to the Empire. There were different titles like Director of the Commission to preserve the New Order, Director of Undercover Bureaus, or Director of Advanced Weapons Research. The latter was the title held by Director Krennic, who was leading the project to develop the Death Star. For that role, he was granted access to the highest echelons of the Empire's hierarchy and stood above most admirals and could also enter the ISB office without anyone questioning it. Their rank plaque was 6 blue tiles and 6 red tiles, at least in Krennic's case, which signified how high up the Imperial ladder he was in terms of Navy and ground forces, as he could take command of them whenever he deemed necessary and order them around to fulfill special tasks for his project. Only thing he had no authority over, as he lacked yellow plaques, was to change the rules and the governance of planets. Governors were responsible for entire star systems, which included several planets, and would get their orders from Coruscant. They were responsible to implement the Empire's philosophy and worldview onto the planets they governed over, but were ranked below the Moffs. Their rank plaques had 6 blue squares over 3 red and 3 yellow squares. As they were outside the military or navy, they were placed above even admirals and could always take command of an admiral's star destroyer if they wanted to. A governor which we saw too much of in my eyes was Governor Price, who was also responsible for Lothal, and she annoyed me to no end. Maybe it was just the weird haircut, though. Moffs were the sector governors. If the governor had a star system, then the Moff had the entire sector, which most often included the star system as well. They were also outside the Imperial military and navy ranking, meaning they were more like politicians, responsible for the way that the Empire conducts itself on their respective sectors, imposing the Emperor's will on their sectors. The title was held by very few people in the Empire, as reaching it required them to embody the Empire's way of thinking absolutely, while also being very capable. Also, while they may mainly handle the governance side of the Empire, they also had absolute civil and military authority in their respective sectors. This made them essentially all-powerful in their sectors and could overrule any preset hierarchy. They had absolute freedom on how to govern their sectors, could declare martial law, override any planetary government, and overrule any military action if they deemed them unfit. In short, no one would question a Moff's orders. They reported directly to the Emperor or other members of the Emperor's inner circle. They usually wore standard Imperial uniform, and their rank plaques had 6 blue tiles, 3 red, and 3 yellow tiles in the same order as the governors. One of the most well-known Moffs is Moff Gideon, the leader of a large Imperial remnant group years after the fall of the Empire. But during the time of Imperial rule, he was infamous for bombing Mandalore and making it almost uninhabitable in order to silence their dissent against the Empire. Arguably, no other political rank is more well known than the Grand Moff, which is one of the highest ranks in the Imperial military aside from a few select individuals. While this rank is well outside the military's usual rankings, Grand Moffs possessed more authority than anyone in the Navy and the Army. They oversee entire sectors of space, acting as governors of oversectors, as the grouped together sectors were called. This made the Grand Moff rank above all the Moffs that were within his oversector. The rank was created on suggestion of Governor Tarkin, who suggested to Palpatine that it would strengthen the Empire's centralized control, as the Grand Moff would act solely to the Emperor's will and ensure that his rule would be implemented throughout the entire Empire. The Moffs were responsible for maintaining order, crushing any dissent or uprising in their sector, and ensure loyalty to the Empire across their sectors, while the Grand Moff would make sure that the Moffs wouldn't step out of line. The aforementioned Governor Tarkin would go on to become the first Grand Moff of the Empire. As Grand Moff, he could overrule everything within the Empire that wouldn't go against the will of the Emperor himself. They could move fleets and troops as they deemed fit and reposition them to strengthen any sector. Their uniform was similar to other Imperial officers, and their rank plaques were the same as the Moffs, with 6 blue squares, 3 red squares, and 3 yellow squares. The only man under the Emperor who holds power that transcends the usual military ladder in the Empire is Darth Vader. He's often called the Empire's enforcer because he has unchecked powers that could only be limited by Palpatine himself. And the only reason for his incredible military and political authority is the fact that he is the Sith apprentice to the Sith Lord, making him the second most powerful man in the galaxy. Vader, of course, often used his nearly unlimited power to its full capabilities. After the fall of the Jedi and the reformation of the Republic into the Empire, he used the Empire's resources to hunt down Jedi across the galaxy, even training fallen Jedi into Inquisitors to help him in this cause. Whenever Vader or his Inquisitors were around, everyone threw military ranks out the window, because they could do whatever they wanted without having to listen to the directives of some of the most powerful officers in the Empire. But before the height of the rebellion, Vader didn't have an exact role in the military hierarchy. Instead, he operated outside it. In fact, the Grand Admiral position was considered the highest non-political role in the Imperial military, but the Emperor created Vader's role as Supreme Commander, giving him complete authority over the entire military. Darth Vader's authority was at such a level that he didn't mind killing admirals on the spot to make a point. Out of all the high-ranking Imperial officers, Vader only respected 2 other people. The first is Grand Moff Tarkin. The second is Grand Admiral Thrawn. Some fans often mistake Tarkin for having a higher rank than Vader because he once ordered him to release Admiral Motti from his force choke. However, Vader only listened to Tarkin because the Emperor told him to respect his decisions. Meanwhile, Thrawn's strategic brilliance and incredible deductive reasoning abilities were the reasons Vader learned to respect the Grand Admiral. At the very top of the Imperial ladder in terms of political and military power is the Emperor, the man whose powers are unlimited. He possesses supreme command over the entire Empire. Grand Moffs are subordinate to his political will. Grand Admirals treat him as their commander-in-chief. Essentially, the Empire's a dictatorship, and only one man is at the top of the ladder, dictating what the other officers would do. Of course, only one man holds this title. He is Emperor Palpatine, the Sith Lord known as Darth Sidious. The Emperor title may sound confusing because of its monarchy connotations, which suggest that he intends to pass the title on to a successor in the future. But the Dark Lord of the Sith doesn't share power with anyone. That means Palpatine intended to be the Emperor forever, holding supreme control over the galaxy for as long as possible. To that end, he pushed forward the Empire's cloning program in an effort to create infinite copies of himself, ready to take on his place in case the old version finally kicks the bucket. And that's it, every Imperial rank and the hierarchy system in the Empire.